Do you think time heals all wounds, or some never close?
At my sister Emily's engagement dinner, I already knew how the evening was going to play out long before I even walked into the restaurant. It had always been the same story in our family. Emily was the star, the one my parents bragged about to every friend and relative, while I was treated like the shadow who tagged along quietly and never quite measured up. I had grown used to it, or at least I thought I had, but what happened that night cut deeper than anything I could have prepared for. We were seated at this long table filled with Emily's friends, her fiancé's family, and a few extended relatives who had flown in just to be there. Everyone was laughing, eating, drinking, and fawning over Emily, and I sat next to my fiancé David, trying to keep my head down and just get through it without making myself a target. My mother had been in rare form all evening, glowing with pride, constantly reaching across to squeeze Emily's hand, acting as though this dinner was some royal event. Then, right before dessert, she decided to make a toast. She stood, glass in hand, cleared her throat dramatically, and said with a little smile that carried just enough venom to sting, "To the child who truly honors this family." The table erupted in laughter, clapping, and cheers. Some of them even glanced at me with that half-smile people give when they know you've been publicly slighted, but want to pretend it's just a joke. I tried to force a smile, but my stomach turned. It was like I had been slapped in front of everyone, and nobody even flinched because they were so used to me being the one overlooked. Emily, of course, grinned like a cat who had just been given a bowl of cream. She raised her own glass high, soaking in the attention, while my dad chuckled and patted her fiancé on the back as if he had just secured the crown jewel of the family. Nobody bothered to acknowledge how cruel those words were. Nobody paused to consider that I was sitting right there. I thought that was going to be the worst of it, just another moment where I swallowed my pride and let it go for the sake of keeping peace. I had told myself 100 times that there was no point in fighting back because I would never win against the family's golden child narrative. But David, sitting beside me, stayed quiet through the laughter, and when I glanced at him, he didn't look amused. He didn't even look surprised. He just looked done. The laughter began to die down, and before anyone could move on to their dessert menus, David calmly set his glass down, reached into his jacket, and pulled out his phone. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't even sound angry, but his words sliced through the air like a knife. "Funny," he said, his tone even almost conversational, "because I have proof of who's actually been paying your bills." The whole table went still. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Emily's fiancé's mother tilted her head, confused. My dad's smile faltered. My mother's hand tightened around her wineglass, like she was bracing herself against an earthquake. I sat there in shock, my pulse pounding, not entirely sure if David was really going to do what it sounded like he was about to do. For years, I had been covering things quietly, paying for things behind the scenes, never asking for credit, never making a scene. It was something I told myself I did to keep the family afloat, to keep us from falling apart, to avoid shame. But deep down, I had also been waiting, almost hoping, for the day when somebody else would finally see the truth. David looked straight at my mother, his phone glowing in his hand, and repeated, "Do you want me to show everyone right now? Because I can pull it up in 2 seconds." The air in the room was heavy enough to choke on. My mother blinked, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something but couldn't. Emily leaned forward, her expression flickering between disbelief and irritation, like this was a joke that had gone too far. The rest of the table just stared, caught between curiosity and discomfort, unsure if they were about to witness a family implosion or just an awkward misunderstanding. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, the balance of power began to shift. It wasn't me defending myself. It wasn't me begging for recognition. It was David, standing up without even standing up, saying the words I had always wanted to say but never dared to. I felt my chest tighten, not just with fear of what was coming, but with the smallest flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Relief. The laughter was gone. The smug smiles had vanished. All that remained was silence, stretched so thin across the table that it could snap at any second. And then David, still calm, still steady, locked eyes with Emily's fiancé's father and said, I think you deserve to know exactly what kind of family you're marrying into." That was where the dinner ended for me, at least in the way it had begun. In that single instant, everything I thought I had to tolerate was no longer mine to swallow. The humiliation wasn't mine anymore. The silence wasn't mine anymore. For once, the truth was about to be theirs to choke on. And that was only the beginning. David did not raise his voice or bang the table, and he did not need to, because when he angled the screen toward my mother and scrolled through a neat line of monthly transfers labeled mortgage, insurance, utilities, and property tax escrow, the room shifted from forced cheer to the kind of quiet that makes people hold their breath, and in that quiet I watched the story my parents loved to tell about Emily being the devoted daughter begin to lose its legs in front of people who had believed it. Without question. He explained, in that steady way of his that always lands harder than shouting, that these transfers had been running for more than 3 years, that he had set up the automation after the third frantic call from my mother about a late fee and a notice, and that the payments came from my account because I had asked him to build a system I would not forget to maintain, since forgetting would have meant my parents risking an ugly mess that would have become public very quickly. My mother tried to smile as if she was humoring a misunderstanding, insisting that families help each other and that Emily had chipped in plenty, and she even looked to Emily for a nod that did not arrive. Because Emily was busy searching the faces around the table to measure how much ground she had lost in a single minute, and the absence of that usual confidence made her voice come out thin when she finally said that I had asked to help. That I did it because I wanted to feel included. I could feel the heat rising in my neck, not because I was ashamed of what I had done, but because I had kept my mouth shut for so long that hearing my choice rewritten as attention-seeking made me realize how thoroughly I had trained them to believe that the person who bails water is only doing it for applause, when in truth I had kept the house from sinking because I could not stand the idea of watching my parents deal with a foreclosure notice, while my sister smiled for photos about her perfect life. David, who had prepared for this more carefully than I realized, tapped through folders that showed bank confirmations, email receipts, and a spreadsheet he had built with dates, amounts, and confirmation codes. And he said that he could airdrop the file to anyone at the table if transparency would help, which prompted Emily's future mother-in-law to clear her throat and ask, in a voice that tried to be kind, whether this arrangement had been discussed with Ryan before he proposed, because large financial dependencies can complicate a marriage, especially when they are disguised as family pride. My father kept his eyes on his napkin as if the stitching could save him, and in that moment I remembered every weekend I had spent driving over to fix some problem that was supposedly too minor to bother Emily with, like the time the car registration lapsed and the late fees piled up, or the time the water heater died and my mother called me in tears because the plumber wanted a deposit that they did not have. I took a breath that turned into a long sentence I had been holding for years, telling the table that I had covered the mortgage because my parents had asked me to do it quietly, that I had paid off a medical bill when my father's procedure ran over the estimate, and that I had even consolidated one of Emily's credit card balances when she was about to default and begged me not to tell my parents because she could not bear another lecture about responsibility, and while I had not asked for thanks, I had at least hoped that I would not be insulted in public by a mother who knew exactly where the money came from. Emily's mouth opened and closed while she searched for the right frame, landing on the accusation that I had picked tonight to make everything about me, which would have stung if it were not so ironic given that up until David spoke, the entire evening had been dedicated to celebrating a version of Emily that only exists when other people are paying for the cleanup. David turned the phone back to me, as if handing me the microphone I had never taken, and I realized that the most satisfying thing I could do was not keep explaining, because explanations had never moved my mother and had never made Emily behave. So I opened my own banking app, hovered over the toggle that controls recurring payments, and heard the smallest gasp from my mother when she understood what she was seeing, since she recognizes the interface better than she admits. I did not make a speech, I did not rant, and I did not ask permission. I simply paused long enough to make sure everyone was watching. Then I canceled the automation that had been feeding the house for more than 3 years. And I said in a calm voice that tonight would be the last time my account covered a bill that someone else liked to brag about. The relief that washed through me was not pretty or noble. It was raw and a little angry, and it tasted like a door finally clicking shut after being held open with my foot for far too long, which might sound harsh until you remember the toast that started this. The dig about who honors the family, the years of being the wallet and the driver and the fixer while someone else took the credit, and if calling time on that game makes me the villain in my mother's version of the story, I can live with that, because I am finished buying myself a place at a table where I am only invited to be the help. Ryan's parents looked at Emily with an expression I recognized from my own worst moments, the expression people wear when the brochure does not match the trip, and Emily, who is quick on her feet when the spotlight works in her favor, sputtered that I was trying to sabotage her engagement, which would have been funny if it were not so predictable. I told her that I was not trying to sabotage anything. I was simply telling the truth that I had been carrying while everyone else told a prettier lie, and then I glanced at the ring on her finger. The one she had flashed all evening like it settled every argument about her being the responsible one, and I let my voice soften as I said that we should probably clear up one more thing before dessert. Because the card that covered the final balance on that ring had been maxed out when she swiped it, and it only went through because I paid it down that week, which means the symbol of devotion she loved to display was, at least in part, funded by the sister who had just been told she did not honor the family. The sound that came out of my mother was not quite a word. My father reached for his water with a hand that trembled, and David, who had never looked more certain, folded his phone into his palm and said that this was not revenge, this was daylight, and that if anyone wanted documentation, we had it. I could feel the room tipping again, the narrative sliding away from Emily's script, and while part of me wanted to stop out of habit, to put a cushion under the fall the way I always had, another part of me, the quieter part that had done the math and signed the checks and waited for basic decency that never came, told me to finish what I had started, because once the truth is out, half measures only invite more lies. My mother whispered that we should not involve outsiders in family matters. Ryan's mother replied that marriage merges families and finances whether anyone likes it or not, and David, not unkindly, said that we were nowhere near done. Because the house and the ring were only the obvious pieces, while the bigger pattern would take a few more minutes to lay out, which was when Emily slammed her glass down hard enough to rattle the silverware and told me to sit down and shut up. I stayed standing, not to tower over anyone, but because I had finally decided not to fold myself into the smaller shape they preferred, and I told Emily that if she truly wanted me to be quiet, she should have started with the toast and the years before it. Then I looked at Ryan and asked if he would like to know why his fiancé's credit report will look different next month than it does today, since certain accounts are about to lose their silent guarantor, and when he nodded without taking his eyes off Emily, I said we could talk plainly or we could keep pretending, but either way the days of me financing the story they told about themselves were over, and as the air thickened again, David leaned in close enough for only me to hear and said that what came next would make everything undeniable, because the biggest lie was not about the mortgage or the ring at all, and that we should be ready to show them exactly how deep the dependency goes. The silence that followed David's warning felt heavier than the clinking of every glass that had been raised earlier, and although I thought someone would try to shift the conversation back to safer ground, nobody dared. Because the air in the room carried the unmistakable tension of people realizing that the story they had been celebrating was no longer stable, and when David said we were only scratching the surface, I felt both terrified and strangely exhilarated, since a part of me had always fantasized about the day when someone else would refuse to swallow the lies on my behalf. Emily's face, usually so composed and ready with a smile, twisted into something brittle, and in her panic she tried to regain control by laughing too loudly, insisting that I was exaggerating, that this was just a family disagreement, and that David was clearly trying to make himself look like a hero by exposing routine financial matters. But the problem for Emily was that the evidence was not abstract, it was not just numbers on a screen, it was receipts that could be verified by anyone, and once a crack appears in a carefully polished image, people start to look closer at everything else. Ryan's parents leaned forward, no longer trying to hide their curiosity, and I could see Ryan himself shift in his chair, his confidence in Emily wobbling as though he was finally connecting dots he had previously ignored. I knew I had a choice at that moment: either retreat into the quiet role I had always accepted, or take the opening David had created and begin telling the truths that had weighed on me for years. So I began with something small, or at least small by my family standards, recalling the time Emily had maxed out a credit card on a trip to Las Vegas, then begged me to wire money to cover the payment so that our parents would never find out she had lost control, and although she had promised to pay me back, of course she never did. Which left me carrying not just the balance, but the embarrassment when collectors started calling my phone because she had given them my number as a backup contact. I watched the faces around the table shift as I spoke, and instead of defending herself with the sharp retorts she normally relied on, Emily snapped that I had agreed to help, that it was my fault for always stepping in, as if doing so made me complicit in the very behavior I was now revealing. I did not stop there, because once the words started flowing I realized how many times I had silently carried her burdens. I told them about the medical bill she had put on a payment plan, and then abandoned until the notices piled up on my doorstep because she had listed my address as her billing contact. I told them about the student loan payment she had skipped repeatedly until I covered it out of fear that it would ruin her credit before she even had a career, and how she had turned around and boasted that her spotless record was proof of her maturity. I even mentioned the car lease that my father had co-signed, but quietly expected me to make good on whenever Emily fell behind, which happened so often that I eventually just set up an account to absorb the charges automatically. The gasps around the table grew louder with each example, but the turning point came when I let the truth slip about the engagement ring, because as Emily had been waving her hand proudly all evening, basking in compliments about Ryan's generosity, I revealed that the card used for the down payment had declined twice until I stepped in to cover the shortfall, ensuring the purchase went through so that the moment she had been dreaming about would not collapse in public. Ryan's face hardened at that revelation, and when his mother asked quietly whether Emily had ever mentioned that detail, the silence that followed was louder than any denial she might have attempted. Emily slammed her hand down on the table and accused me of deliberately sabotaging her future, shouting that I had picked this night of all nights to settle old scores, but I stayed calm and explained that I had kept my silence for years, always telling myself that it was kinder to protect her, to let her shine while I absorbed the mess, but that silence had only encouraged the belief that she deserved credit for stability she had never actually created. My father tried to intervene, muttering something about how families should keep private matters private, but Ryan's father cut him off, saying firmly that financial honesty is not a private matter when two families are about to merge, and that lies hidden under celebrations only wrought into disasters later. I could feel my mother staring at me, her eyes a mix of fury and fear, and I understood that she was not worried about Emily's reputation for its own sake, but about the collapse of the myth she had built for years. The myth that one daughter was the jewel while the other was forgettable, the myth that allowed her to ignore the quiet checks I wrote while pretending Emily was the one keeping everything afloat. And in that realization, I found my voice growing steadier, because I was no longer just cataloging Emily's failures. I was exposing the way my parents had allowed it, encouraged it, and rewarded it, all while expecting me to cover the fallout. The longer I spoke, the more the room shifted toward me rather than away from me, and by the time I paused, I noticed whispers rippling down the table, guests exchanging glances that said more than any speech could. The realization that the family they had come to admire was held together not by Emily's accomplishments, but by my invisible labor. Emily tried one last desperate defense, insisting that none of it mattered because Ryan still loved her and their marriage was secure, but Ryan did not look convinced. And the silence between them was the clearest sign yet that the story was unraveling faster than she could patch it. And then I leaned back, no longer rushing, and said that while I had shared plenty tonight, there were still pieces nobody had seen yet, pieces that would make everything else look small by comparison, and as I let the words hang in the air, I saw the panic flood Emily's face while David placed his phone on the table with a certainty that told me we were not stopping here, because the biggest reveal was still waiting, and it would be impossible to dismiss as exaggeration once it came out. When David said the biggest lie was still ahead, my father finally lifted his eyes from the napkin he had been worrying between his fingers and, in a voice that tried to sound steady, but could not hide the fatigue of a man who has been pretending for too long, he told the table that my mother's toast had been a mistake, that he had asked her not to make comparisons because comparisons never end well, and that if we were being honest, then the truth was painfully simple, since Emily had never carried a bill from start to finish without help, and most months it had been my transfers that kept the lights on. Which he knew because he had watched the confirmations arrive while telling himself that families survive by closing ranks even when closing ranks requires lying to the very person whose help you depend on. My mother hissed his name as though she could push the words back into his mouth, but they were out, and the moment they landed, the room tilted, because the father who usually protected the family narrative had chosen accuracy over performance, and that choice made every earlier denial sound like a script that had run out of pages. Emily reached for outrage because outrage had always saved her, claiming that none of this mattered because love trumps ledgers and because couples work things out privately, at which point Ryan, who had been silent for longer than I had ever seen him silent, asked her if she had told him about the credit cards, the loan that kept vanishing into deferments, and the way her parents' mortgage had been subsidized by the sister who was treated like a guest at her own family table, and when she looked at him without answering, the space between them grew wider than the table itself, since everyone could see that he was not asking to humiliate her. He was asking because he needed to know whether he had proposed to a version of her that depended on secrecy to function. My mother pivoted into the kind of scolding that pretends to be wisdom, insisting that public scenes help no one and that dirty laundry should be washed at home by people who understand context, and I could not help laughing. Not loudly or cruelly, but with the exhausted clarity of a person who has spent years laundering stains that were never hers only to be told that the stains do not exist. David slid his phone back in front of me and whispered that either we stopped here and let them rewrite it again tomorrow or we finished what we came to finish, and, because I knew exactly how tomorrow would sound if we left it unfinished, I said we would continue. But I would do it without theatrics, and then I told the table that the money was not the center of the story, because money is only a symptom of power, and the power in our family had always come from who controlled the narrative. That got repeated at birthdays and holidays, the narrative where Emily was the responsible one and I was the spare who helped when asked, and that narrative had been kept alive not just by my silence, but by the little cables that tethered my accounts to their lives. I opened my banking dashboard again, not to wave numbers around, but to demonstrate that I had learned from my mistake of thinking that love is proven by paying quietly, and I started disconnecting the final auto-withdrawals that fed Emily's comforts, beginning with the wedding vendor retainer that had been linked to my backup card because her own card had failed the verification twice, then continuing with the storage unit that holds the furniture she tells everyone she bought herself, and finally with the family phone plan that I had never meant to own forever but kept in my name because every time I tried to transfer it my mother had a new reason the timing was inconvenient. I told them that I was winding it all down that night and that I was doing it in front of witnesses so nobody could pretend later that I had ambushed them in secret, and while that might sound cold, it was actually the most honest thing I had done in this family in years, since I was giving them the dignity of clarity instead of the temporary comfort of denial. Emily sputtered that I was being punitive, that I was cutting her off to make a point, and I answered that I was not cutting her off. I was handing responsibility back to the person who had claimed it so loudly while quietly outsourcing the cost. And if that felt like punishment, then maybe the problem was not my boundary, but her habit of using me as a silent guarantor. Ryan's mother, who had been watching with the practiced calm of a woman who has seen good people make bad bargains, asked softly whether there was anything else they needed to understand before they made plans that could not easily be undone, and David nodded. Because he knew the part that was about to change everything did not live on a bank statement. I turned to Emily and said that I had kept one last truth because I had wanted to protect her career even when she refused to protect our relationship, but that tonight I was done protecting anything other than my own sanity. And then I explained that the reason her job had survived a disastrous quarter last year, the quarter she claimed she salvaged with relentless work and strategic brilliance, was that her firm kept a key client happy by leaning on a relationship of mine that I had never advertised, a relationship that had opened the door for her in the first place and that I had shielded from scrutiny by hosting the contract under my consultancy rather than under the firm's front office, which kept the procurement paperwork clean at the surface while relying on me to smooth the friction whenever her deadline slipped. My father whispered my name like a warning, my mother went very still, and Emily blinked 3 times very quickly, the way she does when she cannot compute how the pieces connect, and then demanded that I stop talking because none of it was relevant to her engagement, which was the moment Ryan's father leaned forward and, in a quiet voice that carried more authority than any raised tone, asked me to continue. I told them that there would be no public spectacle and no social media performance, that I was not interested in revenge dressed as gossip, and that my next step would be clean and professional. Since I had already drafted a disclosure to Emily's firm's compliance office explaining the conflict that had been hidden under a friendly label, along with a notice to the client that my consultancy would be exiting the relationship at the end of the month, and that I would submit both letters in the morning unless someone in this family could offer a reason that did not rhyme with self-preservation to keep treating a conflict like a favor. Emily said I would be destroying her life, my mother said I would be destroying the family, and I said I was doing neither. I was just turning off the invisible machine that had been propping up a story that could not stand on its own. And that if the story is strong, it will survive sunlight, and if it is not, then I have been paying to keep a mirage alive, which is a bill I am no longer willing to split. There was a murmur from the far end of the table as a few guests made excuses to leave, and I did not blame them, because nobody comes to an engagement dinner expecting to learn the anatomy of a family's denial. But those who stayed watched Emily with new eyes while she tried to decide whether to beg or bluff, and in that suspended moment I pushed my chair back, stood without raising my voice, and said that everyone here now understood the pattern. But that pattern had one more layer that would make everything we had discussed feel like a preface, and that if they cared about truth more than optics they should hear it now, because the biggest thing had not yet been said, and once it was said there would be no going back. David's hand was steady on the phone and my breath was steady in my chest, and while everyone waited for another spreadsheet or another confirmation code, I said that the biggest thing was not a transaction at all but a truth about control. Because money moves in and out while control sits quietly in the corner shaping every decision, and that was when my father, who had spent the entire evening shrinking from the blast radius of his own silence, finally admitted that after his health scare a few years back he had signed the deed into a simple family trust with me as trustee so that the roof would never be lost to bad timing or bad decisions, a step he had taken because he knew I would protect the house even if it meant being disliked. And he had hidden that choice because he did not have the courage to confront the myth my mother needed in order to feel proud when she looked in the mirror. My mother tried to tell him he was remembering wrong, tried to call it a temporary arrangement, tried to suggest that a trust was just a fancy envelope around the same old reality, and that was the moment David opened a folder with the recorded instrument, the assignment, the rider that blocked secondary liens without the trustee's signature, and the renewal letter from the title company addressed to me as the person responsible for authorizations, which meant that the person my mother had toasted as the child who honors this family was living under a roof that could not be leveraged or gifted without my written consent. I did not gloat, and I did not raise my voice, because triumph is often quieter than people expect, and I told the table that I had kept that information locked down for years because the point was never to hold it over anyone's head. The point was to keep a home safe while chaos swirled around it, but since my mother had built a throne on the idea that Emily kept everything afloat, it was time to say clearly that the throne had been standing on documents I signed and payments I scheduled, which does not make me a saint and does not make them villains, but it does make their story untrue, and untrue stories can no longer run my life. Emily called it manipulation and demanded that I unwind it immediately, at which point Ryan's father asked, in that level tone older men use when they are done being charmed. Whether Emily understood that unwinding would require cooperation from a trustee who had no legal obligation to make changes that could harm the beneficiaries, and my mother, who has always prized appearances more than details, finally seemed to understand that the toast had collided with a wall built out of signatures and notarizations that no hashtag can melt. I told them there were two things I had already set in motion before this dinner, because I had planned for the possibility that tonight would go exactly this way, and the first was professional. Since I had finished the disclosure to Emily's firm and scheduled the exit notice to the client for the morning, which meant no more quiet favors, no more invisible scaffolding holding up a tower that was never mine, and the second was personal. Since I had brought with me a set of instructions to record a life estate for my parents that guarantees their right to live in the house for as long as they draw breath while permanently blocking any attempt to use the property as collateral for someone else's dreams. A structure that protects their dignity and removes me from the role of enforcer, because a recorded restriction does not require late-night arguments or guilt or speeches, it simply exists, which is the kind of boundary that families like ours finally respect. My father nodded with a relief that looked almost like grief. My mother stared at the papers as if they were written in a language she refused to learn, and Emily demanded to know why I hated her, which made me exhale in that tired way you exhale when the answer has been the same for years. Because I do not hate her, I just refuse to keep paying the cover charge for her applause. I said that tonight there would be no revenge post, no mass text full of screenshots, no performance for cousins and neighbors, because what I wanted was smaller and harder than public shaming. And what I wanted was to live in a world where my help is a choice instead of a default, where love is not measured by how quickly I solve problems that someone else created, and where respect is not something I buy with recurring payments. And to make that world real, I had already canceled the automatic transfers, ended the phone plan, closed the storage unit account, removed my card from every vendor, frozen my credit to stop new surprises, and written a simple rule for myself that any future assistance would live inside a signed agreement that names the amount, the timeline, and the consequences, which may sound cold to people who love a good story about family loyalty, but which, for me, is simply the only way forward that does not swallow me whole. Ryan looked at Emily, not with cruelty but with the stunned clarity of a man who has just seen a map that contradicts the legend, and he asked whether she would be able to stand on her own without fictional support systems. And when she answered by blaming me again, he did not argue. He just went quiet in a way that told me he had already begun running scenarios that did not end with a wedding hashtag, which is not my victory to celebrate and not my disaster to mourn. It is just the honest outcome of information finally lining up with reality. My mother asked what I wanted in exchange for mercy, and I told her that mercy was the life estate, which I would record regardless of whether she ever apologized. And that respect would look like never again calling me only when the check is due, and never again introducing Emily as the backbone while asking me to be the spine. And if she could not do that, then the boundary would do it for her. Because recorded terms do not bend when tears arrive. I gathered the papers, thanked the guests who had stayed, told my father he could call me tomorrow to go over the simple steps that follow a recording, told my mother that I hoped she would eventually tell herself a kinder story that does not require humiliating one daughter to elevate the other, and told Emily that if she ever wants a real conversation, the door is not locked, but the tab is closed. Then I took David's arm and walked out without looking back, not because I am heartless, but because a person can care and still refuse to be used, which is a lesson I learned the hard way and which I am done unlearning. The night did not end with a cheer or a parade. It ended with the quiet click of a door and the clean knowledge that my life no longer depends on whether my mother raises a glass in my direction. Because I no longer need a toast to confirm what the paperwork already proves, that I protected the home they live in, that I protected my own peace, and that I finally honored myself, which was the only approval I was missing and the only one I ever needed.